in some sense, generosity is looking for the stretch because that's where the leading edge of growing and serving lies. Almost as an instinct within generosity itself. It trains us to be looking for the stretch because that is how our skills and our ideals will grow, and that's how our service will improve. So it will actually be loving and caring for people in a much better way by doing this. It's like almost like an instinct that comes from within us.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif, here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, good to be back here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's nice to be back in the swing of things here, a new year. Kevin, I thought it would be good to do this week's episode on generosity, which I think is kind of like the fundamental, the foundational orientation that would be great for people to have, right? So I don't know if that sounds like a good plan to you.
Yeah, it sounds great. We have spoken a lot about humility, and I always link those two virtues in my mind. So in some ways...
Humility and generosity.
Exactly. So if humility is learning to be accepting of shame and then forgetting about yourself, already at that stage of forgetting about yourself, there's a kind of generosity. And then it's being able to prioritize the benefit of others in how you serve. So rather than serving yourself, well, that's also the real essence of generosity. So I see these two ideals as very closely linked.
Mm-hmm. How much is this like a common topic in general literature of psychology? Because it's, I remember when we talked about Maslow, he talks about how at the peak of psychological health, you get to, perfect self-actualization, which is also self-transcendence. So it seems like he's kind of identifying, that you're perfectly psychologically healthy when you're perfectly generous. Is that a correct reading of him?
I think that's right. I think he understood that you actualize yourself by transcending yourself. So you grow the most by giving the most. So if you're just focusing on your own good, you're not going to have the same growth free and available to you as when you really focus on serving the others and the common good. So I think it goes right back. But what's interesting is I think I have never heard a psychologist or psychiatrist speak about generosity in my entire life. So maybe it is one of the ideals that people are most afraid of. Maybe the only ideal that's scarier to people is obedience. So you talk about obedience, and people freak out.
Yeah.
So we will never do a podcast on obedience. But when it comes to
one of my early jobs, this was my first job as a software engineer, and my boss was kind of asking about things about me, and I said, well, one of my favorite virtues is obedience. And he really liked that. I mean, he thought, wow, this is great. Finally, like a software engineer who's going to do what I tell him to do.
Yeah, it's 1 in a million. Could you imagine?
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that people have this fear of generosity, of even hearing about it, because they equate it with somehow, it's like they think of it, let me put it this way, as self-destructive, self-sacrificing. So that a person who's already like giving all that they can and then say their spouse demands they be more generous. But I think it's really clear that I'm not talking about generosity here as a quality that others demand of us. I'm talking about the free act of wanting to be more generous because you're now working more from love than from fear. Yeah, and I think that humility was essential for that translation, because the deepest fear we have is the fear of somehow being disgraced in the eyes of others. That's what shame is. And so many things that people pursue in life, all the outcomes like wealth and power and position, even like who they associate with and how those people look, In a way, it's all meant to be a buffer against shame. It's interesting how so many outcomes that we are easily enslaved to are really meant to be protection against shame. And it's just because we'd be embarrassed or ashamed of not possessing something or of not having this kind of child or whatever, job or whatever it might be. So humility allows us to be accepting of it, and forgetting about ourselves, so that really then love can start to take over. And we can start to really be with the people attentively that are in our life, give our best attention to them. And I think that sense is that with humility, you have this new capability to form bonds with others. But then generosity is how you deepen the bond.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, I have one quick question and then one follow-up question. So the quick question is, you mentioned that nobody uses the word generosity, but Maslow has kind of a similar concept. So do you mean even Maslow doesn't use the word, or do you mean nobody has this general concept of self-transcendence?
Yeah, I think that I have not seen in, let me say, the positive psychology literature, I have not seen generosity explicitly studied. And so as far as the normal things, gratitude, oh, look, that's studied all the time. Compassion is studied all the time, and being thoughtful and caring. And these things do find expression. But I think generosity is, for some reason, now, I haven't read the entire literature, so it could be that there are really great researchers out there who have actually studied generosity, and I'll comment in the future if I find them. So if any listener, but it's just not something you commonly hear. And certainly when I think of my own training at the Beck Institute and also in residency at UT Southwestern, I don't think that it would have been on the radar that somehow helping people be generous. Actually, I remember thinking about this back in early in my residency. I read a book by Dale Carnegie called Stop Worrying and Start Living. And Dale Carnegie's theory in that book is that if you can successfully transfer your attention to how you can benefit others, so many of your own problems will be put in proper perspective and will be easier to manage. So it's kind of all said in the title. It's one of these books where the title kind of says it all. But it's but the idea is if you really just, put as your priority, trying to make life better for others, and your life actually gets better. So that's really talking about how I'm seeing generosity, and it really produces a profound transformation in us the more we deliberately aim for it in the course of our day.
Now, Kevin, so one thing I do, as you know, is mentor people and students, professionals. And I guess sometimes it's easy to get caught in smaller picture things, like setting a goal to, I don't know, overcome procrastination in this area, or to, start your work with the most difficult task, or, something like this, like these smaller scale strategies. But in your experience with working with people, is generosity something that, okay, you have to build up towards, or is it just like the foundational thing that, hey, you should always be going back to that and trying to help people develop a spirit of generosity and don't worry too much about these smaller things? Or how does it relate to these more maybe tactical kind of changes you could make in your behavior?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think right now there's an entire generation of particularly young men who are not giving their best to life because they don't really see the purpose. I think that they desperately need people to speak to their generosity. They need people that will speak to a reason to actually be giving of themselves. I think there's a huge noble hearts need noble motives to give their best energies. And I think that the younger generation, they have potentially very noble hearts. But somehow, if it's just about seeking more comfort, more consumer goods, more safety and finances, and they're kind of wanting to check out of all of that. So it's interesting that you see in the younger generation a greater willingness to be, I think, to be challenged, to give their best to bigger causes. And there, I think, is going to be increasingly a hunger for great causes among younger people. Maybe this, you see younger people are actually now practicing religion more than some of the older groups. And they don't want any kind of what they perceive as a watered down version. They want the full demanding version. I think we're only going to be seeing more of that. And that's a good sign. I think it's actually a sign of nobility that you're not motivated by petty gains. Well, but then they have to see somehow life is asking them to give their best energies to really benefit the world and the people around them and the families that they can one day have. So I think that with younger people, you can go more directly to what do you most want to see of your life? What's the service that you would love to provide? And I talk a lot with young people about how they want to be serving, what makes them happiest when they're serving. I think with people who are older, it can be sometimes harder because, in fact, they've been serving people for, in some cases, decades and doing an extremely good job at it. But they might get fixated on certain outcomes. And then you have to gently help them to see that really is aiming for self-satisfaction. But if they let that go and just aim to give their best in this, over time, by giving their best, they get the best. And that's, that if you really take care of the process, the outcomes eventually do match it. But it's not always. We can't control outcomes, but we can control the process. And this is the secret of generosity. It's the ideal that intensifies every other ideal. It makes when you think about, say, you want to grow in being caring, well, that means being more generous with your care. You want to grow in being attentive. It means being more generous with your attention. Every ideal is deepened by generosity, and it ties it much more directly to those we love, to those we're trying to serve. So I think that in that sense, it has incredible power when you can successfully tap into it.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. Comparing it to then other concepts that we discussed at OptimalWork, I guess two in particular jump to mind here. One is approach to challenge, and then another is excellence in work and striving to give your best in your work. So those are those fit into generosity. I guess what you're saying is like generosity comes first in many ways. That's that's the key concept of OptimalWork. That's the thing that unites everything else.
Yes.
And then
because I see generosity, just to jump in real quick, it's the willingness to give yourself to others. It's the willingness to stretch yourself in the service of others. So that's why it intensifies every ideal, because it's that stretch. That's where the challenge lies, and that means that's where the growth lies. And generosity aims for the stretch. So it is the ideal that is most directly pro-growth.
Yeah, so engaging challenges is really like for the sake of generosity, and excellence in work is so that you can serve generously other people through your work. Yeah.
And even when you think about what it means to, is there a real dichotomy between self-actualization and self-transcendence? I think, and my guess is that Maslow would agree here. No, actually, because the higher the ideal, the more it is about love and service. So I think that's why there are some ideals, like, I don't know, let's say order, putting order in your work. Well, order acquires its meaning and value from how closely ordered it is to being able to give your best work, give your best service, to be most available to those you love. Like all the reasons to be ordered in your day is so that you can work at your best, which is to serve others in the most noble way, and to be then most available for your loved ones. So I think there's a sense that all the other ideals that are kind of lower and more granular, more closer to almost to skills. Like with order, so much of order is like a skill, or breaking things down into smaller parts. So it's like a skill. But then the higher ideals, eventually, I always love, I'm quoting Flannery O'Connor, not Teilhard de Chardin, who's the one who actually said it, that everything that rises must converge. So, and it's true with ideals, that they converge into love. So love really is what's the motive behind it all. And so the higher ideals are so close to love and service that they're just the most immediate proximate ways of loving and serving.
Yeah. So, okay, I guess one question I have is with anxiety. Sometimes we talk about like a habituation curve. That if you're feeling anxious and you want to, escape some kind of challenge that's a trigger of anxiety, well, if you approach the challenge, your anxiety will habituate and it'll become less
Hmm.
next time and less next time. Now, that doesn't seem to me quite like you're motivating people with the ideal of generosity, but rather you're promising that, hey, things are going to get easier in the future. So just engage it now and you won't have to deal with it as much in the future. So how do you kind of square that approach?
Yeah. So this goes back to it's a 2,000-year-old kind of potential conflict between um, Stoicism, and Christian belief. To say that the Stoics had apatheia as the highest good, and apatheia is a result of habituation. So that gradually, the difficulties are habituated away. Um, but I actually don't think there's a huge. I think that the Stoics would have agreed that frees you actually to be actually give your best in service to your family, to your city, to the whole republic. So I think that they did have this sense of the common good, and that it frees you to transcend yourself. But then that got, I think, brought to a new level. When you're thinking of this kind of a love that is totally self-transcending. So what it means, and so this idea that the habituation takes away a difficulty and produces the apatheia. But that actually is for the sake then of a love that can be totally self-giving, and that idea of a self-giving love, that's the height. Maybe that is the best in the Stoics, and maybe they would agree with that. But then certainly it's the later tradition as well. So I think there's this idea that there are things, the difficulty will habituate, and I think that in some sense, generosity is looking for the stretch, because that's where the leading edge of growing and serving lies. It's like it has like almost as an instinct within generosity itself. It trains us to be looking for the stretch, because that is how our skills and our ideals will grow, and that's how our service will improve. So it will actually be loving and caring for people in a much better way by doing this. It's like almost like an instinct that comes from within us. Generosity is always about it frees us, I would say, to use the best means to the best end. And so it's always raising our end so that we're thinking of what is the best I can aim for in this task. And love and service would be the highest aim. But then it's also willingly embracing the means, even at the price of discomfort. So generosity, once we have the right end in mind, it makes us, in an unlimited way, willing to pay the price. That as long as the end is reasonable and the means are reasonable, then we accept the discomfort that might come along.
Hmm. So, Kevin, how then is generosity, produced or developed in us or in others? I mean, is it the moment of just like, or is it the fruit of just one moment of like a transformation when you kind of realize, oh, this is how I have to live, and then I'll change, and then you live, do something different, or is it something that's built up bit by bit, or is it both? Or I mean, how do you
Yeah.
think of that?
Well, one thing is, if we could have the habit, I mean, I think it has to be repeated a number of times as a short answer, but I wouldn't I wouldn't denigrate the value of having some moments where you really commit yourself to it. You try to see your life in terms of the overall end you want to be serving, and be more generous in that end. Is the whole purpose of your life just having a house with a pool in a certain neighborhood, or whatever it might be? To be thinking of, have you settled for less in your aims? And instead to be thinking of, what does it totally look like, to be capable of mobilizing all of your talent for the sake of greater goods. And I see that primarily in terms of the bonds that we have with others. If we maximize the quality of those bonds, in fact, we will have more and more bonds in our lives. So there is something that, generosity is very particularly related to bonds. That's why it's not purely instrumental. You can't use generosity as a strategy to become wealthy because it's not about any self-serving end. In some way, it takes self-serving ends and then lets us develop, they habituate away. We can develop this kind of healthy apathy, for them as we learn to strive for actually the greater ends.
Yeah, Kevin. So sometimes I guess when I think of generosity, I'm thinking of this like a sacrifice, especially if something in the moment is difficult for me. So I have to overcome some difficulty right now to perform some service for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess it can also involve, other elements like we talk a lot about your attention and how you give your attention to other people. And also, I think you kind of mentioned this whole thing of planning, like deliberation and, planning, structuring your whole life in such a way that it affects or it benefits other people maximally. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit about, the different types of challenges and how we engage those generously.
Well, in general, I think what generosity does is it seals us in a growth mindset. Because, okay, take for an example, take how interested you are in something, right? So now, often I think we have the experience of when a loved one or friend is speaking, that we, may or may not be that interested in the topic that's being talked about. So, I might love hearing about sports, and have no interest in 20th century British literature. Actually, it's probably the opposite. But
It's
probably the opposite. And so just take the question of interest. What am I interested in? Now, that can either be seen as serving myself, my own satisfaction. In that case, I'll just be triaging the conversations that pass by my ears. And when it's something I like, I tune in. And it's something I don't like, I tune out. But that would be like a self-serving use of interest as a concept. And what that does is it leaves my interest generally as something fixed. Like, oh, I'm either interested in it or I'm not interested in it. So if I'm not interested in, hearing about the sporting game, then I just will never be. But if you could think of your interest as something that you can generously invest in others, in their lives, in the things that interest them, that actually now you see that how interested you are is something that is flexible and free. And with generosity, you can deploy it more and more willingly at things farther from your own native interests. So you get interested, in all of these things. I mean, parents experience that when they get really interested in dinosaurs because one of their children has gotten interested in dinosaurs. And so now so I think that it's just a natural thing of love that we tend to take on the interests of others. But sometimes we didn't uncover that there's a little lack of generosity and lack of being loving until we realized that, wow, my sense of being interested was totally fixed. And now I can actually be, so you can exercise generosity then by investing your interestedness in others. And then you can become more interested in other people and in a wider variety of people. And that's also why if you can really practice that in one relationship and do that bond very well, learn how to be generous with your interestedness. Well, you'll find then it's much easier to do with other people too. And you get more and more practice throughout your life. And the more you're genuinely interested in other people, the easier it is to form bonds. And the more interested you get actually in their good and in serving them. So it's a virtuous cycle.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, Kevin, I have one last question for you, which is,
Right.
so the other virtue of prudence, which is, like practical wisdom, how do you right reason in action, could seem to be maybe incline us away from generosity. It's like, well, I don't really think that's the right thing to do, the prudent thing to do, to be
Yeah.
so generous with my time. So, and it seems like in a lot of cases, being generous has to be kind of like tempered by prudence. So we can't just, spend all our time, developing in ourselves the
Yeah.
interests that we see in the people around us. It's like, well, I have a job too, so I can't
Yeah.
just spend hours and hours reading up on everything that every person I know is interested in. So how do we, generosity, it isn't always obvious how to live it, maybe. I mean, is that right?
I think if we are talking about generosity is, like this willingness to embrace fully the right means to the right end. If you understand generosity correctly, it is the perfection of prudence. And so many of the times we don't do the right thing is because we didn't have the right end. Oh, that's imprudent. And so if you are aiming only for your own social advancement and never for the good of your friends, that's not prudent, actually. So prudence here would be seeking truly the greater good, seeking the good of your loved ones. Also, then, many times the reason that even if we have the right end, so you could imagine, I don't know, a teacher wants their students to be thriving and successful in life, and let's say that's a good end. And then but then isn't really willing to use the right means and instead gives all the students A's, no matter how much effort they put in. So it seems like it's helping them toward the right end, but it's actually not the right means. The harder thing would be giving the feedback that they needed, giving them the real lessons that they needed so that they're more resilient and more equipped to thrive in the future. So I think that generosity means the willingness for that, in that case of the teacher, to embrace the difficult task of disciplining a class, of teaching them consequences, of helping them to learn how to apply in their best efforts so that they can get the best results. So not just giving everyone the A. So you could have, so there's ways in which when we're generous and we rightly understand generosity, it means that there's a discomfort involved in the right means and the right end that we're totally willing to embrace. And so it's this kind of willingness. So it means that we're able to make the right sacrifice inside. And it always means we're sacrificing some kind of short-term discomfort for a long-term benefit to others. And it always comes back to ourselves. We benefit the most when we're helping others. It's always better for us to give than to receive. And ultimately, and the more we give to others, the more we always will in some way receive back. But if it's at the cost of prudence, it's not true generosity, I would say.
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, that's a great answer to my question.
Yeah. We can talk more about, because I think there's more to be said on concepts like adverse reliance and where you're enabling other people and their bad behavior, or pathological altruism, and the savior complex. There's all these senses in which there are false senses of generosity that it would actually be good for us also to cover at some point.
To do a follow-up episode. Sounds great.
All right, Sharif.
Okay, well, Kevin, thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
All right, we'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.